Before Apollo became the god of Delphi, the mountain already belonged to something older. Before the marble temples, before the hymns, before the order of Olympus settled upon the earth, Delphi was a place of the deep, a place of stone, of fissures, of hidden currents moving beneath the world. And guarding this sacred ground was Python. Not merely a monster, not simply a beast waiting to be slain, but a serpent of the ancient earth. A force connected to caves, to instinct, to death and rebirth, to the unseen intelligence beneath conscious thought. Because in the ancient world, serpents were never symbols of simple evil. They represented transformation, cycles, healing, hidden wisdom. The forces moving beneath ordinary awareness. And Delphi itself reflected this mystery. The oracle did not rise upward toward the heavens. She descended down into the inner chamber, toward the fissure in the earth, where prophetic vapors were said to rise from below. Because prophecy, in its earliest form, did not emerge through logic. It emerged through contact with something deeper, something symbolic, something instinctive, something that could be felt but never fully controlled. And then Apollo arrived. In the myth, Apollo slays Python and claims Delphi as his own. At first glance, the story appears familiar. Light overcoming darkness, order defeating chaos, civilization triumphing over primordial nature. But beneath the surface of the myth, something far more complicated remains. Because after slaying the serpent, Apollo must undergo purification, and this detail changes everything. If Python were merely evil, why would purification be necessary? Why would the god of light himself become spiritually imbalanced? The myth leaves behind a clue. Something sacred was disturbed. So Apollo leaves Delphi. He journeys northwest to the Vale of Tempe, a sacred valley of rivers, forests, and laurel groves. Unlike the stone heights of Delphi, Tempe is alive, flowing, breathing, not a temple built upon nature, but nature itself. And perhaps this journey is symbolic, because after attempting to establish order over the primordial forces beneath Delphi, Apollo does not ascend higher into abstraction. He returns toward the living world, toward water, toward movement, toward renewal. In the ancient world, rivers represented more than cleansing. They represented transition, the dissolving of what had become rigid. And perhaps this is what the myth quietly reveals, that consciousness cannot fully separate itself from its deeper source without consequence. It is in Tempe that Apollo gathers the laurel branch, and even this symbol carries a hidden memory, because the laurel originates through transformation, through Daphne, the feminine principle Apollo could never truly possess. She does not become conquered, she becomes sacred, and Apollo wears her not beneath him, but upon his crown, as though the myth itself is whispering something profound, that the deeper feminine wisdom of nature cannot be destroyed, only transformed, integrated, remembered. Apollo eventually returns to Delphi, but the older current never disappears. The oracle remains a woman. Prophecy still emerges through trance, through symbol, through ambiguity. Even the name of the priestess, the Pythia, preserves the memory of Python itself, as if the myth is quietly confessing the serpent was never truly removed, only driven inward, and beneath the shining temple of Apollo, the older force continued to speak. And this is where the myth becomes something more than history. Python is no longer simply a creature beneath a mountain. The serpent becomes symbolic of the deeper layers of consciousness itself, the instinctive self, the unconscious, the primordial intelligence beneath identity. And Apollo represents something new emerging within humanity: reason, structure, individuality, civilization, the rise of conscious awareness. But beneath consciousness, the older layers remain: Gaia, the earth, the body, emotion, instinct, the living architecture beneath thought itself. And perhaps this is why purification became necessary, because consciousness cannot sever itself from its source without fragmentation. And perhaps this mirrors something deeply human. We too attempt separation. We separate ourselves from nature, from instinct, from uncertainty, from the body, from death, from the unconscious aspects of ourselves we no longer wish to face. At first, this creates power. The ego emerges through separation, through becoming distinct enough to say, I. But eventually, something fractures, because what is buried does not disappear. The deeper layers continue shaping us, even when unseen. And perhaps this is why so many myths involve descent, caves, labyrinths, underworld journeys, serpents beneath temples, because what is deepest within us is not reached through elevation alone, but through inwardness. The pattern did not end in ancient Greece. Again and again throughout history, new systems rise, new religions, new structures, new identities, and what came before is pushed underground, into shadow, into myth, into the unconscious. Yet the older force always remains, the serpent beneath the temple. And perhaps this is why modern humanity feels increasingly fragmented, because we have become profoundly Olympian. We live through systems, technology, acceleration, abstraction, productivity. The conscious mind has expanded outward in extraordinary ways. And yet beneath this expansion, something ancient still calls to us. The body still remembers, emotion still rises, nature still speaks. The unconscious still moves beneath awareness. The serpent remains beneath the temple. Perhaps the myth of Delphi was never describing the triumph of one force over another. Perhaps it was describing the beginning of a long journey toward balance. Apollo and Python, mind and instinct, civilization and earth, conscious awareness, and the primordial self beneath it, not the destruction of reason, not a return into unconsciousness, but reconciliation, the remembering of what was divided. And perhaps the deepest parts of yourself were never meant to be conquered, only consciously brought into balance. Enter the labyrinth carefully. What waits beneath may not be your enemy, but the forgotten part of yourself. If this path resonated with you, there are more journeys waiting within the labyrinth. More myths, more symbols, more forgotten realms waiting to be remembered. Continue the journey,